Silas Greer yanked the notice off the post with his bare hand, crumpled it, and fed it to the fire pit without a second thought. 3 weeks. Not one soul had answered. Fine. He didn't need anybody. He never had. He turned his back on the lane and started walking toward the barn, and that was the exact moment he heard wheels. Slow, heavy creaking wheels. He stopped. He did not turn around right away. He stood very still and listened the way a man listens when he is afraid of what he might see. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to the channel right now, hit that notification bell, and follow along until the very last word. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that Colorado lane in the autumn of 1874 and find out what Silas Greer saw when he finally turned around. The wagon was not much to look at. One of the wheels had been repaired, badly wrapped in wire and rope at the hub, and it wobbled with every rotation like a tooth about to fall. The horse pulling it was a gray mare, well past her prime ribs, showing beneath a coat that had not been brushed in some time. And on the bench sat a woman, straight-backed, chin-level eyes fixed ahead with 3 children crowded against her like sparrows in a storm. Silas stood at the edge of his yard and watched the whole thing roll toward him. He had lived alone on this land for 6 years. 6 years of silence. 6 years of eating whatever he could manage to throw together over a fire. 6 years of not once hearing another human voice inside the walls of that house, except his own. He was not a man who complained about that arrangement. He had built it deliberately. Silence was something you could trust. People were not. But his back had started giving him trouble in the spring, and by midsummer, he could not spend a full day in the saddle and then come home and cook his own supper without something in his lower spine screaming at him from sundown until well past midnight. He was 43 years old, and he felt 80 some mornings. So he had written the notice. Simple, plain, no room for misunderstanding. Cook wanted. Live in position. Meals 3 times daily, kitchen kept clean. Wages paid monthly. No conversation required beyond what pertains to the work. He had put it up in town on the post outside the general store. He had not felt good about it. He had stood there after tacking it up and looked at it for a long moment and then walked away fast before anyone could ask him questions. 3 weeks. Nothing. He'd made his peace with that too. Put the notice in the fire and told himself he would figure something else out. Buy more dried goods. Eat cold. It didn't matter. And now this wagon was on his lane. The woman pulled the mare to a stop about 10 feet from where he stood, and she looked down at him with dark brown eyes that did not flinch. She had a face that had seen weather, not in a hard way, but in an honest way. The way a person looks when they have been outside working instead of inside hiding. Her hair was the color of dark autumn leaves tucked back under a gray bonnet. She wore a brown dress with a mended patch on the left sleeve, and she held the reins in both hands steady. The 3 children beside her were watching him the way children watch strange dogs, not afraid exactly, just careful. "You Silas Greer," the woman said. "I am. You posted a notice for a cook." He looked at the 3 children again. The oldest, a boy, maybe 12 or 13, stared back at him without expression. Beside him, a girl of perhaps 9 was watching Silas with enormous, interested eyes. And at the end of the bench, half hidden behind his mother's arm, was a small boy, maybe 4 years old, clutching a wooden horse to his chest. "I did post that notice," Silas said. "Posted it 3 weeks ago." "I know. I saw it 2 weeks ago. Took me this long to get here." She didn't offer any explanation for why. She just stated it the way you state a fact about weather. Silas looked at the wagon. He looked at the horse. He looked at the 3 children. "Notice said 1 cook," he said. "Didn't say anything about a family." "No," the woman agreed. "It didn't." There was a silence between them. The wind came through and moved the dry grass at the edges of the yard. "I come with my children, or I don't come at all," she said. Her voice was level. No apology in it, no pleading. Just the plain shape of the situation laid out in front of him. "That's not negotiable, Mr. Greer." "I run a working ranch," Silas said. "Not a schoolhouse. I know what a ranch is." 3 children underfoot. My children are not underfoot, she said, and for the first time, something sharpened in her voice, just slightly like a knife turned to show its edge. They work. Samuel helps wherever he's needed. Nell is 10 and she is sharper than most grown men I've encountered, no offense to you. And Henry is 4 and he stays close to me, and he is quiet, and he is good. She paused. You'll barely know they're here. Silas put his hands in his pockets. He looked down at the ground for a moment and then back up at her. You got experience cooking, he said. I kept a household for 8 years. I can cook for 20 men if you give me a proper kitchen and a fire that draws right. Kitchen draws fine. Then we don't have a problem. He almost said it right then. We do have a problem, ma'am, and it's got 3 small faces and a wooden horse. But something stopped him. He wasn't sure what it was at first. Then a breeze shifted, and he caught it just barely, just for a second, the smell coming from the back of that wagon. Something wrapped in cloth. Something that had been baked recently within the last few hours. Bread. He hadn't smelled fresh bread in 6 years. He hated himself a little for what that smell did to him. You bake, he said. Every week without fail, she said. Sourdough. Cornbread when I have the meal. Biscuits 3 mornings a week. She watched his face. She was smart enough to know she'd found something. She didn't push it, just let it sit there between them in the air. Silas Greer was a man who did not make decisions quickly. He had learned a long time ago that fast decisions were almost always bad ones. He had made one fast decision in his life, and it had cost him years of grief, and a marriage that ended with Eleanor loading a wagon and not looking back down the lane when she drove away. So he thought. He stood there in his own yard with the wind in the grass and a broken-wheeled wagon in front of him, and he thought, There's a room off of the kitchen, he said finally. Small, 1 window. It'll fit a cot and not much else. We've slept in tighter places than that, she said. The children sleep where then? With me. They're small. We manage. I don't want noise after 8 o'clock at night, he said. You won't get it. I eat at 6 in the morning, 12 noon, and 6 in the evening. Not 5 minutes early, not 5 minutes late. I don't eat if I have to wait on it. Then I'll have it ready at 6:12 and 6, she said. I don't want conversation at the table. She nodded once. I'm not much for conversation at meals myself. Silas looked at the boy Samuel again. The boy met his eyes and didn't look away, and Silas felt something move in him, some old recognition. That look. That particular flatness in the eyes that comes from watching out for people smaller than yourself for a long time. He knew that look. He had worn it himself once. What's your name? He said. Abigail Harding. Your husband. Dead, she said. No drama in it. Just the word clean and final. 3 years ago come November. Fever. You've been managing alone 3 years? I have. He believed her. You could see it in the set of her shoulders. All right, Mrs. Harding, he said. Pull the wagon around to the back. I'll show you the room. She didn't smile. She didn't say thank you. She just took up the reins and guided the old mare around the side of the house with the same steady hands she'd had from the moment she arrived. Silas watched her go, and then he stood alone in his yard for a moment longer than was necessary. He told himself it was the bread. The room off the kitchen was exactly as small as he had said. There was a single cot pushed against the wall, a washstand with a cracked basin, and a window that looked out toward the fence line. The floor was clean. Silas was not a man who lived in filth, but it was bare, just raw plank, and in the low afternoon light it looked like what it was. A room that had never been meant for a family. Abigail stood in the doorway and looked at it without saying anything for a moment. The children crowded behind her, the older 2 looking over her shoulders. It'll do, she said. I can bring another cot from the storage shed, Silas said. For the boy, the older one. He glanced at Samuel. That's not necessary, Abigail said. It's no trouble. She looked at him, then really looked at him. And he had the peculiar feeling of being assessed, the same way he had assessed her out on the lane. Not unkindly, just honestly. Then we'd be grateful, she said. He brought the cot. It was old, the canvas worn thin in the center, but it held when he pressed on it. He dragged it in without being asked and set it against the opposite wall. And that was that. He didn't linger. He went back to the kitchen, poured himself a cup of cold coffee, and stood at the window. He heard her in the room, moving things, talking quietly to the children, in a voice too low for him to make out words. Then he heard the girl Nell say something in a clear, carrying voice, the way children who do not yet understand walls will say things. "Mama, is he mean?" And Abigail's reply lower, "Hush." "But is he?" "He's private," Abigail said. "There's a difference." Silas drank his cold coffee. She cooked supper that first evening with what she had brought in the wagon: dried beans, a heel of salt pork cornmeal, and 3 eggs she produced from a cloth-wrapped basket, like they were something precious, which they were. She moved through his kitchen with the efficient, practiced motions of a woman who has cooked in difficult conditions for a long time, in kitchens far worse than this one, in circumstances far harder. Silas sat in the front room with the door open and watched without appearing to watch. He noticed things. She checked the fire twice before she was satisfied with the heat. She talked to herself under her breath while she worked. Not words, more like the low thinking sounds a person makes when they are calculating. She sent the older boy Samuel out back for more wood without looking up from the pot, and Samuel went without being asked twice. The girl Nell appeared at Silas's doorway, once looked at him with those enormous eyes, and then disappeared again without speaking. The small one, Henry, sat in the kitchen doorway with his wooden horse in his lap and watched his mother with an attention that was almost solemn. The smell that came out of that kitchen over the next hour was something Silas Greer had no adequate preparation for. It was beans and salt pork. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would turn heads in any town. But it was hot, and it was real, and it was made by someone who knew what they were doing. And it hit something in him so deep and so old that he had to put his hands on his knees for a moment and look at the floor. He could not have told you what exactly he felt. He might have called it hunger if pressed. But it was not hunger, or not only hunger. She knocked once on the open door at exactly 6 o'clock. "Supper's ready, Mr. Greer." He came to the table. She had set his place at the head alone with a plate and a spoon and a cloth laid alongside it. She and the children sat at the far end of the table, the way workers in a big household might sit separate from the family. The arrangement struck him as both correct and wrong at the same time, though he could not explain that contradiction to himself. He sat down. She served him first a deep bowl of beans, a thick wedge of cornbread still steaming from the pan. He did not say anything. He had said he didn't want conversation at the table, and he had meant it. He took a spoonful of the beans. He ate the whole bowl without stopping. He ate the cornbread. He sat back. At the far end of the table, Henry was telling his wooden horse something in a whisper, and Nell was kicking her feet against the chair rung in a slow, steady rhythm, and Samuel was eating with his eyes down the way a boy eats when he is very hungry and is trying not to show it. Silas looked at the empty bowl in front of him. "There's more," Abigail said quietly. He passed the bowl without a word. She filled it without a word. He ate the second bowl, and then he pushed back from the table and stood up and said, "Good meal," because there was no way to get up and leave without acknowledging it. 2 words. That was all. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said. He went to bed at 8 o'clock, as he always did. He lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and listened to the sounds that were in his house. Now sounds he had not heard in 6 years. The low voice of a woman settling children. A child's protest, small and sleepy. The creak of the kitchen floor. The sound of dishes being washed, water poured, a fire banked for the night. He lay there and listened to all of it, and he told himself it was an intrusion, a disruption, a complication he would have to manage. But somewhere behind the place where he kept his arguments, and his reasons, and his careful arrangements, something else was happening. Something was thawing. He did not sleep well that night. Not because of the noise, they were quiet as she had promised, but because of the silence that lived between the small sounds. The kind of silence that is different from emptiness. The kind that exists only when other people are present somewhere in the house and breathing. He had forgotten that kind of silence. He had forgotten completely, and without realizing it, that there was any other kind. In the morning he came out at 5:30 as he always did to check on the horses before breakfast. He expected to have the kitchen to himself for half an hour. Abigail was already there. She had the fire going and a pan of biscuits in the oven and coffee on the boil, and she was standing at the window with a cup in her own hands, looking out at the gray pre-dawn yard with an expression he had no name for. She heard him come in, and she turned and looked at him with those steady eyes and said, "Coffee's ready. Biscuits in about 10 minutes." He stopped in the middle of the kitchen. "You're up early," he said. He did not mean it as a complaint. He did not know what he meant it as. "I'm always up early," she said. "Always have been." She turned back to the window. Silas poured his coffee. He stood at the other end of the kitchen and drank it. They did not speak again for 8 minutes. Then the biscuits were done, and she pulled them out, and he sat down, and she put 4 of them on his plate with butter she had found in his cold box, and he ate them, and they were the best things he had put in his mouth in 6 years. And that was a fact he would sooner have died than admit it out loud. He put on his hat and went out to the horses. At the door he paused, one hand on the frame, his back to her. "Good biscuits," he said. He heard her set her cup down on the counter. "Thank you, Mr. Greer," she said. Same as the night before. Quiet level, no flourish. He went out into the cool morning air, and he stood in the yard for a moment with the coffee still warm in his chest and the taste of those biscuits in his mouth. And he looked out at the land. His land, every acre of it earned and held and kept at considerable cost. And he thought about how a man can go years and years in a condition he has decided is fine, and then something arrives on a broken-wheeled wagon on an ordinary afternoon, and the fineness of it suddenly comes into question. He did not pursue that thought. He was not yet ready to pursue that thought. He went to the horses, and he did his work, and he kept his face as plain and closed as he always had, and the ranch went on exactly as it always had. But when he came in at noon, and the smell of salt pork and potatoes and something he could not immediately identify, something sweet, something baked with brown sugar, if he was not mistaken, rolled out from the kitchen and caught him in the doorway. He stood there for 2 full seconds with his hat in his hand before he remembered to keep moving. In the kitchen, Nell looked up from the corner where she was sitting with a battered ledger book in her lap. The child was writing something in it with intense concentration, and said to him matter-of-factly without preamble, as if they had been in the middle of a conversation, "Did you know that a person can go 3 weeks without food, but only 3 days without water? Mama told me that. She knows a lot of things like that." Silas stopped. He looked at the child. He looked at Abigail, who was at the stove with her back to him, and he could see from the set of her shoulders that she was waiting to see what he would do. He looked back at Nell. "Is that so?" he said. "It's a fact," Nell said, and went back to writing in her ledger. Silas hung his hat on the hook by the door. He sat down at the table. From the corner of the kitchen, Henry lifted his wooden horse and showed it to Silas without any words. Just a solemn presentation, as if Silas had asked to see it, and here it was. Silas looked at the horse. He looked at Henry. "Fine horse," he said. Henry lowered it again and held it against his chest with both arms and looked very satisfied. And Abigail at the stove made a sound, then very quiet, barely a sound at all, that Silas realized after a moment was a laugh. Not a big laugh. Not a performing laugh. Just a small, involuntary, surprised laugh, the kind that escapes a person before they can decide whether to let it out or not. She cleared her throat and went back to stirring the pot. Silas sat at the table and looked at the grain of the wood in front of him and tried to sort out what was happening to him. He was not a man who laughed easily. He was not a man who noticed small things. A child's presentation of a wooden toy, a woman's suppressed amusement, the way a kitchen can feel different depending on who is standing in it. He noticed all of it. He sat with the noticing and said nothing, and waited for the meal, and told himself that was all this was. A man eating a meal, a woman cooking it, 3 children quiet and present and alive in a house that had been dead for 6 years. Nothing more than that. He told himself that with some force sitting in his kitchen at noon on the second day of this new arrangement. But outside, the Colorado wind moved through the dry autumn grass, and the old house settled on its foundation, the way houses settle when they are full of something they have been missing. And Silas Greer, who had fed a notice to a fire pit the very morning this woman arrived, sat at his table and ate the best meal he had eaten in 6 years. And somewhere beneath all his stillness and his arguments and his long practice of needing no one, something old and quiet and stubborn began very slowly to come back to life. By the end of the first week, Silas had stopped counting the days. He did not decide to stop. It simply happened the way a habit dissolves when something interrupts the rhythm of it. He had been counting since the beginning, a quiet inventory in the back of his mind. Day 1 day, 2 day 3. As if the arrangement had a fixed endpoint he was moving toward. As if he needed to track the distance between himself and the moment they had arrived so that he could measure how long before things went back to the way they had been. But somewhere between Tuesday and Wednesday of that first week, he lost count, and he did not notice until Thursday morning when he tried to remember and could not. And he set down his coffee cup on the kitchen table with more care than was necessary and sat with that for a moment. He did not know what it meant. He was not sure he wanted to find out. What he did know was that the food had not faltered once. 6 in the morning, 12 at noon, 6 in the evening, Abigail Harding had not missed a single one. She cooked like a woman who took the work personally, like each meal was a statement she was making, and she intended every statement to be correct. The beans had been followed by a rabbit stew on the third evening, the rabbit provided by Samuel, who had gone out behind the north fence with a sling and come back with 2 of them before Silas had finished his afternoon rounds. Silas had watched the boy clean them at the post outside the kitchen door quick and sure with a small knife, and he had not said anything then. But later he had told Abigail that the boy had good hands. She had looked up from the pot. "He learned young," she said. "Who taught him?" A pause. Short but there. "He taught himself," she said. "After his father died, there wasn't much choice." Silas had nodded and gone back to the front room, but he had thought about that answer for a long time afterward. He taught himself. He had said the same thing once when someone asked him how he had learned to manage land alone. Same answer, same flat matter-of-factness behind it. He hadn't recognized it as loneliness at the time. He had thought it was strength. He was beginning to wonder if he had been confused about the difference. On Friday of the first week, the problem arrived. It did not arrive with any warning, which was the nature of problems that matter. Silas was in the barn working on a split rail in the back stall when he heard the wagon come up the lane. Not Abigail's wagon, which was parked and silent under the lean-to, but another one heavier with a horse he didn't recognize. He came out of the barn with the hammer still in his hand and saw Dwight Collar sitting on the bench of a buckboard, looking around the yard with the particular expression of a man who has come to appraise something. Dwight Collar was the nearest neighbor, if you could call a man 3 miles down the road a neighbor. He was 62 years old, wide in the chest, narrow in the eyes, and he had a habit of smiling that never quite reached anything behind the smile. He had tried to buy this land from Silas twice in 6 years. Both times, Silas had said no. Both times Collar had smiled that smile and said he understood, and the next season he had come back with a slightly higher number and the same smile. "Silas," Collar said from the bench, not getting down. "Dwight," Silas said. "Heard you hired on some help." Collar looked toward the house. The kitchen window was lit from inside, and through it faintly came the smell of something on the stove. "Heard it was a woman." "You heard right." Collar let the silence sit for a beat. That was a technique of his, letting silences sit, as if waiting to see what a man would put into them when he got uncomfortable. Silas did not get uncomfortable. "Widow woman, they say," Collar said. "From over past Glenwood Way. Come with 3 children." "That's right." "Seems like a lot of trouble," Collar said, "when there are single men plenty who'd take the work and not bring complications with them." "I didn't ask your opinion on my hiring, Dwight." Collar smiled. "No offense meant. Just saying a man living alone taking in a widow and her children, people talk, Silas. You know how people talk." "I've never cared how people talk." "Well," Caller shifted on the bench. I came by on another matter, actually. That north pasture of yours bordering my property. Fence line's been unclear for 3 years now. I'd like to settle it before winter. Have my man come by next week with a survey. Silas looked at him. The fence line's not unclear. It runs exactly where it ran when my deed was filed. That's a matter of some dispute, Caller said pleasantly. It's not a matter of any dispute, Silas said. Come by with a survey if you want to waste your time and your man's. The line is where it is. Caller nodded slowly, still smiling, and gathered his reins. All right then. You take care of yourself, Silas. He glanced toward the house again. You and your cook. He drove away at an unhurried pace, and Silas stood in the yard and watched him go with the hammer at his side and a cold feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He went inside. Abigail was at the stove. She did not ask him who the visitor was. She did not ask him anything. She kept her back to him and her hands on the work. Abigail, he said. She turned. A man will come by next week, he said. Name of Dwight Caller. He is not to be let inside this house. He is not to be spoken to beyond a good morning. And if he asks you anything about me or about this property, you tell him to find me. She looked at him steadily. Is he trouble? He thinks he is, Silas said. I've managed him before. All right, she said. She turned back to the stove. He watched her for a moment, the set of her back, the calm of her hands, and he felt something that was approximately gratitude, not for the answer, but for the absence of more questions. He had been married to a woman who wanted to know everything immediately and all at once. And he had never been built for that kind of conversation, and the gap between what Eleanor needed and what he was capable of giving had grown year by year until it was a distance neither of them could see across. He was not drawing comparisons. He was just noticing. He went back to the barn to finish the rail. He was halfway through when he heard a sound from the other side of the barn wall from the narrow space between the building and the fence. A scuffling, and then a thud, and then a sharp intake of breath that was recognizably the sound of a child trying hard not to cry. He put down the hammer and went around. Samuel was on the ground beside the fence post, holding his left arm against his chest, his face white and his jaw tight. On the top rail of the fence above him was a rope tied in a rough loop, one end still wrapped around the post. The boy had been trying to hang a rope from the top rail and had fallen. Silas crouched down. How bad? He said. Fine, Samuel said through his teeth. You're not fine. Let me see the arm. I said I'm fine, boy. Silas said it flat and quiet, the way you say a word when you want it to be the last word on the subject. Let me see the arm. Samuel looked at him with that flat, watchful expression that look Silas had recognized from the first moment, and then, slowly, he held out his arm. It wasn't broken. Silas ran his fingers along the bone with the careful touch of a man who had set his own injuries more than once over the years, and nothing shifted under the skin. Bruised badly, maybe worse, but not broken. What were you doing up there? Silas said. Samuel said nothing. Was you trying to rig a gate latch on the post there? A pause. Then the boy said very quietly, The gate swings open when the wind comes from the west. I noticed it. I thought if you ran a rope from the top of the post to the corner brace, you'd have a way to tie it shut from either side, Silas finished. Samuel looked up at him. That is correct, Silas said. And that is exactly what I've been meaning to do for 2 months. But you do it from the ground, using the brace post and a step loop, not by climbing the rail. You understand. The boy was quiet for a moment. Then, Can you show me? Silas stood up. He held out his hand. Samuel looked at it for just a second, and then took it and let himself be pulled to his feet. They did not speak about the fall again. Silas showed him the step loop method, which took about 10 minutes, and Samuel watched with the whole front of his attention, asking 2 sharp questions that told Silas the boy understood exactly what he was being shown, and was already figuring out how to apply it to other problems. When they were done, the gate held solid. Good, Silas said. Yes, sir, Samuel said. It was the first time he had called him sir. Neither of them acknowledged it. Samuel went back toward the house, holding his arm carefully. At the corner of the barn he stopped. Mr. Greer, he said. Silas looked at him. That man who came today, Samuel said. The one in the buckboard. He looked at our wagon a long time before you came out of the barn. Silas was still. Just thought you should know, Samuel said and went inside. Silas stood in the yard alone for a long time after that. He was not a man given to alarm, but he was a man given to attention, and what Samuel had just told him was worth attention. Collar was not a man who looked at things idly. If he had looked at that wagon, he had been measuring something, the state of it, the load in it, the signs of how permanent or impermanent the people who owned it intended to be. He was checking to see if they were staying. The realization moved through Silas slowly, and then all at once, the way cold does when you step out of a warm house. Collar was not concerned about the fence line. Collar had never been concerned about the fence line. Collar was concerned about Silas having people on this property. People who might make it harder for a solitary rancher to be pushed and maneuvered and eventually worn down to selling. A solitary rancher was a contained problem. A rancher with a family was a different proposition entirely. Silas went inside and said nothing about it, and ate his supper, and went to bed at 8 o'clock, and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling. In the room off the kitchen, he heard Henry say something to his mother in a sleep-thickened voice, and he heard Abigail's answer low, wordless, a sound that existed only to say, "You are safe. I am here." Sleep now, and the house was quiet after that. He thought about Collar's smile. He thought about Samuel's arm. He thought about a 10-year-old girl writing in a ledger with intense concentration and a 4-year-old boy presenting a wooden horse like it was something worth seeing. He thought about a broken-wheeled wagon that had made it 3 weeks' worth of difficult road to get here. He did not sleep for a long time. When he finally did just before midnight, his last conscious thought was not about the fence line or the north pasture or Dwight Collar's intentions. It was about the step loop on the gate, which would hold all winter, and the boy who had noticed the problem before he had, and the simple practical fact that some things once fixed held better than they ever had before. He was not ready to think beyond that. But the thought was there, quiet and insistent, the way honest thoughts are when a man has been too long in the habit of pushing them down. Something on this ranch had changed. And not just the gate. The surveyor showed up on a Monday. Silas saw him from the north pasture, a thin man in a brown coat picking his way along the fence line with a chain measure and a wooden stake, stopping every 10 feet or so to crouch down and sight along the ground. He had a boy with him, young maybe 16, who carried the other end of the chain and drove stakes when told to. Silas watched them for about 30 seconds. Then he rode across. "Morning," he said from the saddle. The surveyor looked up. "Morning. You'd be Greer?" "I would." "You'd be Collar's man." "I work for Mr. Collar, yes, sir." "Then you've come out here on a fool's errand," Silas said. "And I don't hold that against you personally, since you're being paid for your time. But I will tell you what I told your employer. This fence runs exactly where it ran when the deed was filed with the county office in 1868. You are welcome to measure all you want. The line will not move." The surveyor had the cautious look of a man who had been caught in the middle of other people's disputes before and had learned not to have opinions about them. "I'm just doing the work I was hired to do, Mr. Greer." "I understand that," Silas said. "Do it on your side of the fence." He rode back without waiting for an answer. He was halfway to the barn when he saw Abigail standing at the edge of the yard, watching the surveyor in the distance. She had a dish towel in her hands, and she was turning it over and over without seeming to notice she was doing it. "That's the second move," she said when he came close enough. Not a question. A statement. He pulled up and looked at her. "The first was the visit," she said. "Sizing up the property, sizing up us. Now he sends a man to survey a line that isn't in dispute to put you on notice that he's not finished." Silas regarded her for a moment. "You've seen this kind of play before." My husband's family had land in Ohio, she said, and her voice went carefully flat, the way it did when she was talking about something that still had edges. Neighbor wanted it. He didn't come at us with a gun. He came at us with lawyers and surveys and quiet pressure, and one bad season at a time, until my father-in-law had nothing left to fight with. She stopped turning the dish towel. What does Caller want specifically? The north pasture. Maybe more if the north goes easy. And you won't sell. I will not sell. She looked at him directly. Then you need to make that unmistakably clear to him. Not to his surveyor. To him. I've told him twice. Telling a man like that isn't the same as showing him, she said. A man like that only understands one language. She went back inside. Silas sat on his horse in the yard and stared at the back of the house and thought about that for a long time. She was right. He knew she was right. He had known it since the first time Cowler drove away smiling, but knowing something and acting on it were two different problems, and the action required here was not one he had the full resources for. Not yet. He went to feed the horses, and he did not stop thinking. That evening something happened that had nothing to do with Cowler, and everything to do with why Silas Greer had been losing sleep since October. He was at the table after supper, going over the season's account book, a task he dreaded, and always put off too long, when Nell climbed up into the chair across from him with her ledger tucked under her arm, and set it on the table, and opened it without ceremony, as if sitting down to do accounts across from Silas was a thing she had been doing her whole life. He looked at her. She looked at her ledger. "What are you writing in that thing?" he said. "Everything," she said. "Everything. Everything that happens, so I don't forget it." She smoothed the page with her palm. "I've been keeping it since Papa died. Mama said it was a good idea to write things down so the important things don't get lost." Silas put down his pen. "What do you write about?" he said. He did not know why he was asking. He was asking. "Today I wrote that Samuel fixed a gate with Mr. Greer and didn't complain about his arm, even though it was still hurting." She did not look up. "I wrote that Mr. Greer noticed Samuel's work and said it was good without making it a big thing which Samuel needed." The room was very quiet. "I also wrote that the biscuits this morning were the best yet," Nell added, "in case anyone disputes it later." Silas looked at this 10-year-old girl across the table and felt something move in his chest, a small, almost painful shift, like a door on a rusted hinge being pushed open for the first time in years. "You write about me in there," he said. Nell looked up at him with those enormous clear eyes. "Yes, sir." "What do you write?" She considered him for a moment with the seriousness of someone deciding how honest to be. Then she turned a few pages back and read aloud. "October 14th. Mr. Greer looked at Henry's horse today and said it was a fine horse. Henry talked about it the rest of the afternoon. Mr. Greer did not look like a man who says fine horse to children. He looked like he had to think about it first. I think he is not used to children, but he is trying. I think he is a good man who forgot how." Silas did not say anything for a moment. "That'll do," he said quietly. Nell closed the ledger. "I only write true things," she said in the tone of someone making an important clarification. "I can see that," Silas said. She slid off the chair and went to bed. Silas sat alone at the table with the account book open in front of him and the lamp burning low, and he did not look at the numbers for a long time. He is a good man who forgot how. He was still sitting there when Abigail came out of the back room to bank the kitchen fire. She stopped when she saw him. "You all right?" she said. "Your daughter," he said. Abigail waited. "She's something," he said. It was not an adequate word. He knew it wasn't. He did not have a better one available. Abigail looked at him with an expression he had seen on her face twice before, when he had told her the biscuits were good, when he had pulled Samuel to his feet. That same expression, like she was watching something she had not expected to see, and was being careful not to startle it. "Yes," she said. "She is." She banked the fire and went back to the room, and Silas stayed at the table until the lamp needed trimming, and then he closed the account book and went to bed, and did not look at the numbers once. The twist when it came on a Thursday morning with no warning and no courtesy. Silas came in from the early rounds to find Abigail at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the surface and a letter in front of her. He knew from the way she was sitting very straight, very still, the way she went still, when she was controlling something, that the letter was not good. He sat down across from her. "What is it?" he said. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, and he understood that she had already done whatever private reckoning she needed to do before he came in, and what was left was just the facts. "It's from my husband's brother," she said. "Thomas Harding. He's been trying to locate me since August." She paused. "He says he has a legal claim to the children." The word legal dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "On what grounds?" Silas said. "He says that as the only surviving male relative of James Harding, he has the right and the obligation to provide for James's children." She said it in the flat, reciting voice of a person repeating something that disgusts them. "He says a widow woman traveling alone with 3 children and no fixed address or income constitutes an unstable situation for the children's welfare." "You have a fixed address," Silas said. "You have income, as of 6 weeks ago," she said. "He wrote this before he knew where I was, but he knows now." She tapped the envelope. "There's a return address in Denver, a law office." Silas looked at the letter. "He didn't come himself," Silas said. "Thomas Harding has never done anything himself in his life," she said, and there was something cold and controlled in her voice that he had not heard from her before. "He sent James's father to the fever ward twice before James died, and did not come himself then either. He hired men to sell off James's tools when I was 3 months widowed, and sent me a letter about it after the fact." She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "He does not want my children, Mr. Greer. He wants to be seen as the man who intervened. There's a difference." "Does he have standing?" Silas said. "Legally?" "I don't know," she said. "I don't have money for a lawyer." "I do," Silas said. She looked at him fast. "I'll write to Will Hadley in Glenwood," Silas said. Will Hadley was the only lawyer in 2 counties that Silas trusted on the grounds that Will Hadley was the only lawyer in 2 counties who had never tried to get anything out of him. "He's a plain man. He'll tell us straight what we're looking at." The word "us" came out before he thought about it. Abigail looked at him in a way that made him aware of what he had said. He did not take it back. "You'd do that," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm doing it," he said, and stood up and went to the desk for paper and pen, before she could say anything else. He wrote the letter in 10 minutes plain direct, stated the situation without embellishment, and then he sealed it and set it by the door for the next trip to town, and sat back down at the table. Abigail was still sitting across from him. She was looking at her hands. "He's going to come," she said quietly. "Thomas, if the lawyer writes back and tells him the claim won't hold, he'll come himself. That's how he works. He escalates until someone flinches." "Let him come," Silas said. She looked up. "I have said what I have said," Silas told her, and his voice was exactly the voice he had used on Collar, on the surveyor, on every man who had ever come onto his land looking for something he was not going to give. "Let him come." Something crossed her face, then something that was not quite relief and not quite hope, but lived in the neighborhood of both. She nodded once. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. She got up and went to the stove. Outside, Henry found Samuel at the fence and showed him a rock he had found with a stripe of quartz running through it, holding it up with both hands, the way he held everything he considered important. Samuel looked at it. He said, "That's a good one, Henry." And Henry tucked it into his pocket and looked very satisfied. Silas could hear them from where he sat. He picked up his pen and looked at the account book again, and this time he did work through the numbers, and what the numbers told him was that the ranch was sound. Not wealthy, not easy, but sound. It had been built to last because he had built it that way on purpose, stone by careful stone, season by season, for 6 years alone. He had built it, he realized now, for no one in particular. He had never let himself think past that. He was thinking past it now, and the thought was frightening in the way that only real things are frightening. Not the sharp fear of a fast danger, but the deep, slower fear of something that is already happening, whether you are ready for it or not. There were now 3 children on this ranch who trusted him in degrees he had not sought and could not quite bring himself to refuse. There was a woman at his stove who had walked into his life on a broken wheel in October and had not broken anything else since, had in fact quietly repaired several things without being asked or thanked. There was a letter in an apron pocket from a man in Denver who thought he was going to take something, and Silas Greer, who had not cared what happened to anything beyond the fence line of this property for 6 long years, found that he cared about this. He cared about this deeply and without reservation, and the depth of it scared him, and he was not going to do a single thing differently because of the fear. He closed the account book. He went outside. Samuel was mending a piece of harness near the barn door, the work steady and patient, his bruised arm moving more easily now. Henry was sitting 3 feet away in the dirt, the striped rock in one hand and the wooden horse in the other, conducting some kind of quiet negotiation between them. Silas stopped beside Samuel. "When you're done with that," he said, "I want to show you the north fence line, all of it, every post." Samuel looked up. "Why?" "Because you should know this land," Silas said, "every foot of it, and because there may come a time soon when knowing it matters." Samuel held his gaze for a moment. That flat measuring look. Then something in it shifted, just slightly, the way a sky shifts before it changes weather, and the boy said, "Yes, sir," and went back to the harness. Henry looked up from the rock and the horse and said, "Can I come?" "No," Samuel said. "Yes," Silas said at the same moment. Samuel looked at him. Silas looked at Henry. "He can keep up," Silas said. Henry was already on his feet. Will Hadley's reply came back in 8 days. Silas read it at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold beside him, and when he was done, he read it again, and then he set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way a man looks at the ceiling when he is deciding how to carry news. The news was not good, and it was not catastrophic. It lived in the uncomfortable middle ground that lawyers specialize in. Will Hadley wrote that Thomas Harding had no automatic right to the children under Colorado statute, but that a determined man with money and a cooperative judge could make the process ugly and long and expensive. He wrote that the strongest counter-argument was demonstrable stability, fixed residence, reliable income, adequate provision for the children's welfare. He wrote that if Mrs. Harding's current situation could be established clearly and documented, the claim would likely fail. He wrote the word likely twice, which was the lawyer's way of saying he was not making any promises. Silas folded the letter. Abigail was at the stove. He could tell from the set of her back that she had been waiting since the moment he'd sat down, holding herself very still the way she did when she was braced for something. "Will Hadley says the claim is weak," Silas said. "But a weak claim can still be made expensive." She turned around. "He says your strongest argument is stability," Silas said. "Fixed address, steady work, proof that the children are provided for." "We've been here 6 weeks," she said. "That's 6 weeks more than you had in August." She looked at him carefully. "Silas, if Thomas shows up here with a lawyer and points at a widow woman cooking for a bachelor rancher, they will not paint that picture kindly." He had thought about that. He had been thinking about it since the letter arrived from Denver, turning it over at night, the way you turn over a stone to see what lives under it. He knew what she was saying. He knew it was true. "Let me worry about the picture," he said. "That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's what I have right now, and I'm asking you to let it stand until I've worked it out properly." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right," and turned back to the stove, and the conversation closed like a door, but not all the way, not all the way, and they both knew it. 3 days later, Dwight Collar came back. This time he brought a man with him, not the surveyor, someone different. A younger man in a clean coat who sat on the bench beside Collar and watched everything with sharp, quiet eyes, and did not speak unless spoken to. Silas recognized the type immediately. Not a ranch hand. Not a hired muscle. A man who had been to school somewhere and used what he'd learned in the service of men like Collar. Silas came out of the house when he heard the wagon and stood on the porch with his arms at his sides. "Silas," Collar said, "this is Mr. Vance. He handles some legal matters for me." "Counselor," Silas said. The man named Vance nodded pleasantly. "I want to settle this fence business before the ground freezes," Collar said. "My surveyor found a discrepancy of 40 feet along the north line." "Your surveyor found what he was paid to find," Silas said. "I'll have Will Hadley pull the original deed documents, and we can settle it in front of the county recorder. I've said that from the start." Collar's smile stayed exactly where it was. "That could take months, Silas. Winter's coming. I'm prepared to offer you fair compensation for the disputed acreage right now today. Save us all a long process." "There's no disputed acreage," Silas said. "There is only my acreage which I intend to keep." Vance spoke for the first time. His voice was smooth professional, designed to sound reasonable. "Mr. Greer, I understand your position, but I want to be candid with you. A prolonged legal dispute over a boundary line tends to affect property valuations. It creates uncertainty in the title, which makes land harder to work with, financially harder to borrow, against harder to expand from. That kind of uncertainty has a way of accumulating." It was a threat dressed in a business suit. Silas had heard fancier versions of the same thing, and plainer ones. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I have held this land for 6 years, through 2 bad winters, a summer drought, and a cattle fever that took half my herd in 1871. I have held it without borrowing against it, without partners, and without neighbors who wished me well. I am holding it now, and I will hold it after you and your employer have found something else to occupy your time. Is there anything else?" Collar stopped smiling. Not visibly, the shape of the smile stayed on his face, but the thing behind it went away. "You think about it," Collar said. "I won't be doing that," Silas said. They drove away. Silas stayed on the porch until the wagon was off his lane, and then he went inside and found Samuel standing in the kitchen doorway. The boy had heard all of it. His jaw was tight, and his eyes had that old flatness in them, that watchfulness, the look that a 12-year-old should not have to have worn long enough to be that practiced. "He's not going to stop," Samuel said. "No," Silas agreed. "He's not." "What are you going to do?" Silas looked at him. Not at a boy. At whatever Samuel was becoming, which was something harder and more necessary than a boy. "I'm going to make it too costly for him to continue," Silas said. "That's the only language a man like that listens to. You make the thing he wants cost more than it's worth, and he finds something else to want." "How?" "That," Silas said, "is what I'm working on." He went to the desk and wrote a second letter to Will Hadley, this one longer and more specific, outlining Collar's surveyor, the visit from Vance, the implicit threat to the title. He asked Will to file a formal notice with the county recorder, establishing the fence line as documented in the original deed, a preemptive move, nothing aggressive, just public and on record. He asked Will to do it fast. He sealed the letter and put it with the first one for town. Abigail set supper on the table at 6 o'clock, and they ate in the quiet that had become their ordinary quiet, not the empty silence of before, but the full silence of people who are thinking about the same things and do not need to name them. Nell ate 3 biscuits and recorded something in her ledger under the table, which Abigail pretended not to see. Henry fell asleep, sitting up between one bite and the next, his head drooping toward his plate, and Silas reached over and steadied the bowl before it tipped without thinking about doing it. Samuel saw that. He said nothing. But he saw it. The twist came on a Saturday, which was the kind of day twists favor ordinary enough that you are not watching for them. Silas was mending a water line on the east side of the property far enough out that he could not hear the house, when Samuel came riding fast on the old gray mare, riding bareback, because he had not taken the time for a saddle, and that told Silas everything about the urgency before the boy said a word. "Man at the house," Samuel said, pulling up hard. "Came in a hired coach from town. Mama told me to find you." Name? Samuel's jaw was set. Harding, he said. He says he's our uncle. Silas was already moving toward his horse. He rode back at a pace that was not quite a run, but close to it, and when he came into the yard, Thomas Harding was standing on his porch. Silas noted as if he had been invited with his hat in his hands and his coat buttoned, and the precise assembled look of a man who had rehearsed this arrival. Thomas Harding was perhaps 50, soft in the way of men who have not done physical work in a long time, with the kind of face that is handsome in a weak way, features that would have been striking on a stronger person, but on him just looked arranged. He turned when Silas rode in and watched him dismount with careful measuring eyes. Abigail was in the doorway of the house behind Harding, not touching him, not speaking. Her hands were at her sides, and her face was composed, and behind the composure was something that Silas recognized immediately, because he had felt it himself, contained fury, the kind a person holds in with both hands, because losing it will cost them more than it costs anyone else. Nell was somewhere inside invisible. Henry was pressed against Abigail's leg with his wooden horse held against his chest in both arms, staring at Thomas Harding the way a small animal stares at something large that it is not sure about. Silas tied the horse and walked to the porch. "Mr. Harding," he said. Thomas Harding turned the polished smile on him. "Mr. Greer, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I'm Thomas Harding, James Harding's brother. I've come to check on my sister-in-law and the children." "You've checked on them," Silas said. "They're well." Something flickered behind Harding's eyes. "I'd like to speak with Abigail privately, if I may." "You may speak with her right here." "Mr. Greer, I don't believe that's—" "You came to this property unannounced," Silas said, keeping his voice level and his eyes steady. "You'll speak to Mrs. Harding in my hearing, or you won't speak to her at all. That is not a negotiation." Thomas Harding looked at him for a moment, and then looked at Abigail, and then looked back at Silas. He was recalculating. Silas could see it the way a man recalculates when the situation he arrived expecting is not the situation he finds. He had arrived expecting a widow on uncertain ground, isolated, dependent, afraid. He had found something else. "Very well," Harding said, and his voice had changed, still smooth but thinner now. "Abigail, I'm concerned about the children's situation. 3 children living in a hired hand's room on a stranger's property." "This is not a stranger's property," Abigail said. "This is where I work. This is where my children live. There is a roof and heat and food and steady wages, and there is nothing irregular about it." "You're a single woman living on a single man's—" "I'm an employed woman living in an employer's household," she said. "That is a condition shared by thousands of women in this country. If you have a specific legal objection, you can raise it with Will Hadley in Glenwood, who represents my interests in this matter. Otherwise, I don't know what you came here to accomplish, Thomas." The name came out sharp and final, like she was putting it down and not picking it up again. Harding's rehearsed composure cracked just slightly at the edges. He looked at Silas. "You engaged a lawyer." "Mrs. Harding engaged a lawyer," Silas said. "I facilitated the introduction. This is a family matter, Mr. Greer. It doesn't concern you." And here was the moment. Silas understood it as clearly as he understood anything. The clean hinge-point quality of it. The way a man's life sometimes produces a moment where he can say a thing that is true or say nothing and let a lie stand, and whatever he chooses will hold weight for a long time. He chose. "These children eat at my table every day," Silas said. "That boy has worked this land beside me. That little girl knows more about what goes on here than most grown men I've employed, and this woman has kept this house in better order than it's been kept since it was built." He stopped and let that sit for exactly one breath. "That makes it my concern, Mr. Harding, whether you find that convenient or not." Thomas Harding looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Henry, who was still pressed against Abigail's leg, watching everything. Henry looked back at him with the solemn, unblinking assessment of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend things are fine when they are not. "James's boy," Harding said. And for the first time, something changed in his voice. Something real slipped through the polished surface of it. Something that might have been genuine. Whether it was grief or guilt or some complicated mixture of both, Silas could not say. It was there for one moment, and then Harding pressed it back down. "He looks like James," Harding said quietly. "Yes," Abigail said. Her voice had gone carefully neutral. A silence opened up between them, between Harding and Abigail, that had years in it, complicated, painful years. And Silas stepped back without quite stepping back to let them have it, because some things belonged only to the people who had lived them. Harding put his hat back on. "I'll be in Glenwood for 2 days," he said. "I'll speak to your Mr. Hadley." He said it without the earlier smoothness, just the flat fact of it. "That's fine," Abigail said. Harding looked at the children one more time. He looked at Henry longest. Then he nodded once to Silas. Not a deferential nod, not a friendly one, just an acknowledgement, and he went to his hired coach and got in and drove away. The yard was quiet. Henry looked up at his mother and said, "Is he gone?" "He's gone, sweetheart," Abigail said. "Good," said Henry, and went back inside with his wooden horse. Nell appeared at the window. She had been there the whole time, Silas realized, watching and writing everything down in her mind, if not her ledger. Silas and Abigail stood on the porch alone for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Her voice had lost its composure just slightly, just enough to show what was underneath it. Just enough. "You didn't need me," he said. "No," she said. "But you were there anyway." She went inside. Silas stood on the porch in the cooling afternoon and looked out at his land, every acre of it, and felt the unfamiliar, complicated weight of what he had just done and said and meant, and the even more unfamiliar feeling that he would do it again without hesitation, and the most unfamiliar feeling of all, which was that somewhere between October and now, the boundary of what he considered worth defending had quietly, irrevocably expanded. He had not asked for any of this. He had not asked, and it had come anyway on a broken wheel at 6 o'clock sharp, 3 times a day. He had no idea what to do with that. But for the first time in 6 years, not knowing what came next did not feel like a threat. It felt like something else entirely. Will Hadley wrote out himself, which Silas had not expected. Most lawyers sent letters. Will Hadley drove 12 miles in a buckboard on a Tuesday morning because, as he said, when he climbed down and shook Silas's hand, some things were better handled face to face, and this was one of them. He was a compact man, in his mid-50s, gray at the temples, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades listening carefully to what other people say when they think they are saying something else. He shook Abigail's hand when Silas introduced them, which not every man in 1874 would have done without hesitation, and he sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of Abigail's coffee and got directly to the point. "Thomas Harding has no case," he said. "I've looked at the statute and I've looked at the man, and I'll tell you plainly the statute is clear and the man is bluffing." He folded his hands on the table. "A relative's claim to guardian authority over living children requires demonstrated parental neglect or incapacity. Mrs. Harding, you have demonstrated neither. You have employment, fixed residence, and 3 children who are visibly fed, clothed, and intact. Any judge in this county would look at Thomas Harding's claim and ask him what exactly he thinks he's doing." Abigail had her hands around her coffee cup. "He won't let it go easily," she said. "Maybe not," Will said. "But I spoke with him yesterday in Glenwood, and I told him what I just told you, and I told him the cost of pursuing it further, and I told him what public record would show about his history of contact with his brother's family, which is to say very little. He is a man who values his reputation." Will paused. He asked about the children, not in a legal way, just asked how they were. Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Henry looks like James," she said finally. "Yes," Will said. "He mentioned that." Another pause, heavier this time. Silas watched her work through something privately, some complicated mixture of old grief and old anger that he didn't have the full map of, and he did not try to interrupt it. "He can write to them," she said at last. "If he wants to know them, he can write. He doesn't come here without my word, and he doesn't come alone. But he can write. Will nodded. I'll convey that. That is all he gets, she said. For now. Will looked at Silas. And the other matter. Caller. What about it? I filed the boundary notice with the county recorder on Thursday. It's public record now, properly documented, stamped, and witnessed. Caller's surveyor's findings have no standing against an original deed filing. Will picked up his coffee. Caller knows this. His man Vance is competent enough to have told him the day I filed. I expect he'll find a different piece of land to covet. Silas exhaled slowly. Not with relief, not quite, but with the particular feeling of a weight that has been pressing on you for weeks, finally shifting somewhere else. What do I owe you, Will? He said. Write me a letter if anything else comes up, Will said. He finished his coffee and stood. And invite me to the wedding. He said it the way he said everything plainly, without drama, as if it were already a settled matter. The kitchen went very still. Will put on his hat and nodded to Abigail and walked out to his buckboard without any further comment, because Will Hadley was a man who knew when he'd said the right thing and had the good sense not to add to it. Silas stood in the kitchen with Abigail, and the word wedding hung in the air between them like smoke after a shot present impossible to ignore, already having done what it came to do. Abigail was looking at the table. He's a plain-spoken man, she said. He is, Silas agreed. She picked up Will's empty cup and carried it to the wash basin. Her back was to him. He could see the tension across her shoulders, not the controlled tension she held when she was braced for trouble, but a different kind. The kind that comes from something you have been not saying for a long time, pressing against the place where you keep it. Silas opened his mouth, closed it. He went out to the barn. He spent the better part of the afternoon there doing work that needed doing and work that didn't. And somewhere in the middle of it, Samuel came and worked beside him without being asked. And they repaired a split post in the fourth stall and replaced a rusted hinge on the main door, and did not speak for most of it, which was one of the things Silas had come to value about the boy. Samuel understood that sometimes the work was the conversation. Late in the afternoon, without looking up from the hinge, Samuel said, "My father built things." Silas kept working. What kind of things? Furniture mostly, tables and chairs. He was good at it. A pause. He used to let me hand him tools when I was little. I didn't know what any of them were for. He'd just say the flat one or the bent one and I'd figure it out. Sounds like a patient man, Silas said. He was. Another pause. You're patient too. Different way, but patient. Silas set down the hinge tool and looked at the boy. Samuel met his eyes without the old flatness, without that protective distance, and what was there instead was something that cost the boy something to show. Not sentimentality, not a bid for approval, just honesty offered plainly the way his mother offered things. Your father would be proud of you, Silas said. For what that's worth coming from me. Samuel said nothing for a moment. Then, it's worth something, he said, and picked up the tool and handed it back, and they finished the hinge. The twist, the last one, the one that broke everything open, came from the smallest person in the house. It was after supper. The dishes were done, and the fire was banked low, and Henry had fallen asleep in the front room on the rug with his wooden horse tucked under his chin, because Henry fell asleep wherever the evening found him, and no one had the heart to move him immediately. Abigail was in the kitchen. Samuel had gone to the room. Silas was at the table with his account book, not looking at it. Nell came and sat across from him. She had her ledger. She opened it. She appeared to be writing something, but she was not. She was watching him over the top of the page with those enormous, deliberate eyes. And he knew she was watching him, the same way he had known every other thing about this child, which was immediately and without doubt. Nell, he said. She said, not looking up from the fake writing. Whatever you're about to say, go ahead and say it. She set down her pencil. She looked at him directly. Are you going to marry my mother? She said. The question landed exactly the way a question does when it is the truest one in the room, with a kind of finality, a kind of relief, like a window being opened in a house that has been closed too long. Silas did not look away from her. He would not look away from her. This child had told him in her own handwriting that he was a good man who had forgotten how, and she had been right, and she deserved a straight answer. "I don't know," he said. That's not entirely my question to answer." Nell tilted her head. "Have you asked her?" "No." "Why not?" He sat back in his chair. He looked at this 10-year-old girl who kept a ledger of true things and spoke without decoration, and had, without being asked, to kept a record of every moment he had been better than he thought he was. "Because I'm not sure she'd want that," he said. Nell stared at him. It was the stare of a person watching another person say something so obviously incorrect that they are trying to determine whether he is joking. "Mr. Greer," she said with extraordinary patience, "my mother has not laughed once in 3 years. She laughs here, every day." She paused, and in the pause, she allowed him to absorb that. "She also makes biscuits in the morning before you come in. She didn't used to make biscuits. She only started doing that when she found out you liked them." The room was very quiet. "I notice things," Nell said. "I write them down." Silas looked at his hands on the table. "I'll tell you something else," Nell said. And now her voice had a gravity to it that was not 10 years old. That was something older and more careful. "Samuel was angry when we first came here. Not at you, just angry. At everything. He hasn't been angry since the day you showed him that step loop on the gate." She paused again. "And Henry talks to his wooden horse about you, every night. He tells it what you said and what you did." She stopped. Then simply, "So yes, Mr. Greer, you should ask her." She picked up her ledger and went to bed. Silas sat at the table alone for a long time. In the back room he heard Abigail moving the quiet domestics of a woman ending her day. He heard her check on Henry, heard her murmur something to the sleeping boy, heard the soft step of her returning to the kitchen for something she had forgotten. She stopped when she saw him still at the table. "I thought you'd gone to bed," she said. "Not yet," he said. She went to the window and looked out at the dark yard for a moment. He watched her profile, the line of her chin, the way she held her shoulders, the shape of a woman who had been carrying the full weight of her life for 3 years without asking anyone to help. Not because she was too proud to ask, but because she had learned by experience not to rely on the asking. "Abigail," he said. She turned. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because that's the only way I know how to say things." She was very still. "When you drove up this lane in October," he said, "I had just burned the notice. I had decided I didn't need anyone, and I had made my peace with that, and I believed it completely." He stopped. "I was wrong about that. I have been wrong about that for 6 years, and I didn't know it until a broken-wheeled wagon showed up on my lane, and a woman told me she came with her children or not at all." Abigail's hands moved to the edge of the counter behind her and gripped it just slightly. "I am not a man who has a lot to offer in the way of easy company," Silas said. "I go quiet when things are hard. I work instead of talking. I have made significant errors in this area before, and I will not pretend otherwise." He paused. "But I know what this land is worth, and I know what it needs, and I know what I am capable of building on it if I'm not building it alone." The room was absolutely silent. "I am asking you to stay," he said. "Not as a cook, not as hired work, as my wife. If that is something you are willing to consider." He stopped. Then, because Will Hadley had been right about plain speaking, "I am asking because I love you, Abigail. I don't know when it happened, and I couldn't give you a date if you asked. But it is a true thing, and it has been true for some time. And I am done not saying it." Abigail stood at the counter and looked at him. Her eyes were bright but not wet. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not crying now. She was looking at him the way she had looked at him in the very first moment from the wagon bench with those steady measuring eyes. Except that this time, what she was measuring was not a stranger. This time, she was measuring something she already knew. "You said you made significant errors," she said. "With Eleanor." "Yes." "Tell me one." He had not expected that. He looked at her for a moment, and then he told her the truth, because she had asked for it, and she deserved it. I made her feel invisible, he said. I was so busy holding everything together that I stopped letting her see that I needed her here. I made it look like I could manage without her, and I was so good at looking that way that she eventually believed it. He paused. I don't want you to ever believe that, Abigail. Not for one day. She was quiet. The children, she said, are already here, he said. They are already part of this ranch in ways I didn't expect, and couldn't have planned for, and I would not have it otherwise. Her grip on the counter edge loosened. Her shoulders came down just slightly, just that much. Samuel is going to argue with you, she said, about ranch decisions. He has opinions, and he doesn't hold them back. Good, Silas said. I can use a man with opinions. Nell will write everything you say in her ledger, and she will read it back to you when you are inconsistent. Then I'll try to be consistent. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not the small, surprised laugh from before something larger, something that she let come all the way up. Henry will want to show you his horse every single morning, she said. I know, Silas said. It's a fine horse. She laughed. Then a real laugh, full and unguarded, the laugh of a woman who has been careful for 3 years and has found against all reasonable expectation a place where she does not have to be. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and she took both of his hands in hers, and she held them the way you hold something you have carried a long way and are finally setting down somewhere safe. Yes, she said. Silas Greer, yes. He stood up. He was not a man who made large gestures. He had said that himself and meant it. So he did not make one now. He just held her hands and looked at her face and felt the particular, irreversible settling of a man who has been lost for a long time and has just without entirely meaning to come home. Nell was not asleep. He knew this. She was in the back room with her ledger on her knees writing. He did not know exactly what she was writing, but he had a good idea. November. Mr. Greer asked Mama to stay. Not as a cook. She said yes. Henry is asleep and doesn't know yet, but he will be very happy. Samuel will pretend he already knew. I did know. I have known since the day Mr. Greer said it was a fine horse. That was the day I knew for certain he was the right kind of man. Outside, the Colorado night was cold and clear, and full of stars that had been there long before any of them, and would be there long after, indifferent to the specific happiness of one rancher and one widow and 3 children in one small lit house on one particular piece of ground. But inside that house the fire was warm, and the children were safe, and the man who had burned a notice and told himself he needed no one had his hands full of proof that he had been wrong. Beautifully, entirely, irreversibly wrong. And Silas Greer, who had spent 6 years mastering the art of surviving alone, learned that night what he had never let himself understand before, that a man can endure anything in silence. But it takes a family to make the silence worth breaking. That was the truth of it. That was all of it. And it was enough.